Hello, students, and welcome. Today, we're going to dive into a wonderfully humorous and, a very thought-provoking story from your textbook called The Snake and the Mirror. It's written by the very famous Malayalam writer Vaikam Muhammad Bashir. What's so special about this story is how it's told from the point of view of a young doctor and how it brilliantly mixes moments of real fear with some laugh-out-loud comedy. But before we start, let me ask you a little question. Have you ever been in front of a mirror, maybe just fixing your hair, and you just paused for a moment to admire yourself? It's a pretty normal human thing to do, isn't it? Well, today we are going to see how this simple act of looking in a mirror becomes the main focus of our story and tells us a whole lot about our main character. All right, so here's our plan for understanding the story. First, we'll meet the doctor and get a feel for the world he lives in. Then we'll look at his rather big plans, which lead to a truly scary situation. After that, we'll see a clever, ironic twist, find out how the story ends on a funny note, and finally, we'll talk about the important lessons we can learn from it all. So let's begin at the beginning, shall we? In this first part, we'll set the scene and get properly introduced to our narrator, the young doctor himself. Okay, so the story is set on a hot summer night. The narrator, a doctor who has just begun his medical practice, lives in a very, very simple place. I want you to just imagine this. A small, rented room. This room has no electricity, so the only light is from a single kerosene lamp. And he's not alone either. He mentions that he and the rats share the room. His earnings are what the story calls meager, which means very, very small. In fact, he only has about 60 rupees in his suitcase. Now, this setting is so important because it really highlights the huge difference between his poor reality and his very proud, ambitious thoughts. Now, even though he's living in such a simple place, our doctor has some very grand plans for himself. This next part of the story, it's a really interesting look at human vanity. So while he's sitting there, in front of that mirror, the doctor makes what he calls two earth-shaking decisions. First, to look more handsome, he decides he will shave every day and grow a thin mustache. I mean, he is a bachelor and a doctor after all. Second, admiring his own smile, he decides he's going to always keep that attractive smile on his face. Then, another lovely thought comes to him: marriage. He decides he will marry a rich woman doctor. But here's the really funny part. She must be fat. And why? His reason is that if he ever makes a mistake and needs to run away, she won't be able to catch him. These thoughts are just so humorous because they show his pride and his overconfidence perfectly. What's really interesting here is the phrase the doctor uses. He calls his plans for shaving and smiling earth-shaking. This is a perfect example of a literary device called hyperbole. Now, don't worry, hyperbole is just a simple way of saying that a writer is using extreme exaggeration to make a point or to be funny. By calling such small decisions earth-shaking, the author is humorously showing us just how important the doctor thinks he is. In his own mind, these plans are a very, very big deal. And this slide just brilliantly shows the gap between his dreams and what actually happened. See, he dreamed of marrying a rich, fat doctor with a good medical practice. But as he tells his listeners later in the story, God had other plans. His actual wife turned out to be a thin person with the gift of a sprinter, the complete opposite of what he had planned. And this contrast, well, it makes the story very funny. Just as the doctor is lost in these grand daydreams, reality strikes, and it strikes in a very, very terrifying way. The feeling of the story now shifts from humor to suspense. As he's sitting there, dreaming his grand dreams, he hears a noise. A dull thud, as if something had fallen onto the ground. And then, just silence. It's a snake. And not just any snake, but a full-blooded cobra. It lands right on his shoulder and coils around his left arm. Its hood is spread out, and its head is just 3 or 4 inches away from his face. Can you just imagine the terror of that moment? The doctor describes his reaction with these words: "I was turned to stone." He didn't tremble. He didn't cry out. He was just completely frozen with fear, like a statue. But while his body was absolutely still, his mind was very, very active. In that moment of extreme danger, all his pride, all his vanity, it just disappears. He feels the presence of God. He tries to write the words, "Oh God," in his imagination. And then he's suddenly hit by this terrible, humbling thought. If the snake bites him, what medicine does he have? There are no medicines in his room. And right then, he realizes he is just a poor, foolish, and stupid doctor. All his grand plans seem so meaningless, and he can only manage a weak little smile at his own foolishness. And just when it seems like all hope is lost, the story takes another surprising turn. We've come to the great ironic twist, where that feeling of terror is about to change into something completely unexpected. It almost seemed as if God had appreciated his moment of humility. The snake, it turns its head away from the doctor, and what does it see? It sees its own reflection in that large mirror on the table, and the snake, it becomes fascinated by its own image. Now, this brings us to a very important literary device: situational irony. It sounds like a big term, but it's actually simple. Situational irony is just when the result of a situation is the complete opposite of what you would expect, right? We expect the snake to be a deadly threat, but instead, it gets distracted by its own beauty. Just like the doctor was, the snake's vanity is what ends up saving the doctor's life. It's a really clever use of irony to bring humor into a moment of extreme fear. So as the snake gets more and more interested in its reflection, it slowly unwinds itself from the doctor's arm. It creeps onto the table and moves closer to the mirror, maybe to get a better look at itself. Seeing his chance, the doctor, who is no longer a stone image but a man of flesh and blood, quietly gets up and runs for his life. So the doctor escapes to his friend's house. Whew! But the story isn't quite finished yet. The author has one final funny twist for us at the very end. The next morning, the doctor goes back to his room with some friends to get his things. But when he gets there, he finds that a thief has already saved him the trouble. Almost everything is gone. The room has been completely cleaned out. But the doctor says the thief hadn't taken everything. No, he had left one single thing behind, almost as a final insult to the poor doctor. What do you think it was? His dirty vest. The doctor jokes that the thief must have had such a good sense of cleanliness that he refused to take the one dirty piece of clothing. This final detail just ends the story on such a light-hearted, comical note. It gives us what we call comic relief after a very, very tense situation. So after all that humor and all that terror, what are the main takeaways? Let's take a closer look at the key themes and ideas that Vaikom Muhammad Bashir is presenting in this wonderful story. Firstly, the story gently makes fun of vanity and pride. I mean, both the doctor and the snake are so taken with their own reflections. Secondly, it shows us how quickly a tough dose of reality, like a cobra on your arm, can make our grand plans seem silly. The story also shows us how you can find humor even in the scariest situations. And very importantly, it teaches us about staying calm in a crisis. The doctor's stillness is what saved him. And finally, and maybe most importantly, a near-death experience can take away all our pretense and lead to true self-realization, making us see ourselves for what we are, just poor, foolish, and stupid humans. And that brings us to the end. I'd like to leave you with two questions to think about. First, what does the mirror really represent in this story? Is it just an object, or is it a symbol for something deeper about us as people? And second, how do you think this whole experience changed the doctor? Was he still the same vain and proud person after this encounter? Think about these questions because they will really help you understand the story on a much deeper level. Thank you for listening.